Family Policy Alliance and Foundation. My name is Joseph Combe. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Family Policy Alliance, or FPA as we call it, and I'll be your host for this episode. FPA has been blessed by God to have had an outsized impact on public policy protecting families and vulnerable children from sexualization and the imposition of LGBT ideology. We are grateful for that, and we are grateful to you, our supporters, for enabling that. We do, however, not want to lose touch of the many impositions that are still being attempted on our families across the country, particularly in certain states. And joining us today is my friend and colleague, Rebecca Delahunt, from our state FPC, the Minnesota Family Council and Institute. She serves as their Director of Public Policy, and she's going to help us become more cognizant of some of these threats in this specific legislative session this year. So, Becca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Joseph. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you here, and we're just excited for all you're going to inform us of and encourage us about up there in the Great Lakes state. So to start with that, there are some major policies that are being proposed in your legislative session going on right now, and we want you to keep our audience informed about them. So let's start with the first one, the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, some people will have heard this term before, mostly in a federal context, because that's where a similar bill has been proposed, but this one is specific to Minnesota and has implications for the entire country as well. So, Becca, tell us, what is the Equal Rights Amendment in Minnesota, and what would it mean for all of our pro-family and social conservative issues?
Absolutely. Well, like you hinted at there, Joseph, it really touches on all of our issues. So the Equal Rights Amendment is something that's been around for decades, but the language that we're seeing today across the nation is very different than what we saw in decades past. And this, like I mentioned, is an amendment. And so it wouldn't be a statutory change to Minnesota statutes. It would be something voted on by the legislature and then proposed and then voted on by Minnesota voters in an election. So it could be 2024, 2026. And the ERA has already passed the Minnesota Senate. So its last stop is the Minnesota House before being proposed to voters. And the language that passed the Minnesota Senate last year stated that equality under the law shall not be abridged or denied on the basis of a lot of good things that we would agree with, right? We don't want anyone to be discriminated against on the basis of their race or color. But then it adds gender identity or expression. It did include the word sex, which has been interpreted to mean abortion. But since that proposed amendment got voted on by the Minnesota Senate, it's come out through media and through ERA Minnesota that new language might be changing this proposed amendment and be voted on by the Minnesota House. And this new language explicitly includes reproductive freedom, pregnancy outcomes, and it still includes gender identity and expression. And it excludes any religious freedom protections that existed in the previous language. So the previous language included creed, which is, pretty broad and not very explicit, but the proposed updated language does not include creed. Now, some of the timing of this is still getting worked out. It hasn't been voted on in the House, like I said, and the new language hasn't even dropped in the government website. But we're expecting, based on the advocacy organizations that are working on this, that this language is the updated language. And so, Joseph, I'm sure there's so many different impacts that I would like to get into. Like I said, it touches on all of our areas.
Yeah, I want to ask you about some of those. I'm going to ask you about the implications for at least two of the areas, maybe three. But first of all, I just want to make sure I understand the process. So this is called the Equal Rights Amendment. Correct me if I'm wrong. Does that mean they are actually amending the Minnesota Constitution by passing this, if they do?
Correct. Yes,
okay.
Thank you for adding that. So this would be an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution. This would not be to the U.S. Constitution, even though that's been discussed. And I think it's kind of an evergreen discussion in D.C. But this would be to the Minnesota Constitution.
Okay, so that's why the legislators will vote on it in this current session, and then it will go on the ballot for regular Minnesotans to vote, along with some of their other electoral office votes. Is that correct?
That is correct. And this is kind of getting into the details of the Minnesota system, but we operate on a 2-year cycle. And so bills or proposed amendments can be live for 2 years. So this was voted on. The ERA was voted on by the Minnesota Senate. It passed, unfortunately, with bipartisan support. 9 Republicans in the Senate voted for it. But it hasn't yet passed the Minnesota House, and they have until the end of session, which is near the end of May of this year, before they have to restart, and the proposed amendment wouldn't be live anymore. So working toward that end, but they have until May, the Minnesota House, to vote on this, and then it would get proposed to voters to vote on in either the 2024, maybe 2026 election.
Okay, that's it. Well, that's a little bit encouraging, I would say, because it means that even if the House does pass this sometime before May, at least the people of Minnesota will also have a say in this. And with the great work you all do at the grassroots level, that could be very promising. But I do want to ask you about some of the implications for what this would mean for some of our social conservative and pro-family issues. Let's start with the LGBT side of things. You say it would add things like gender identity and sex to the Minnesota Constitution. What would be the practical implications of that? How would it affect everyday Minnesotans?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we're very concerned about adding, equality under the law on the basis of so-called gender identity or expression, because anyone can take on any gender identity or expression at any time based on this language. And so males would have, the utmost right to identify as female, whatever that means. I want to use scare quotes there, because what does it mean to identify as a woman when you're a biological male? But that totally changes the way our females are allowed to or will interact in society, right? So right now we have sex segregated spaces like locker rooms, restrooms, prison facilities, and certainly sports teams. Athletic opportunities for females is a big area of discussion right now. And based on the language of this amendment, we think that women will not have access to those sex segregated facilities anymore. Instead, males will have, well, not that women won't be allowed, however, the males will be allowed to have access to those spaces, right? We know that this is happening already, but there isn't a constitutional right to those spaces yet. And so we see things like prison facilities becoming a huge concern. There is already a male actually in Shakopee Women's Prison, Joseph, with fully intact male genitalia, who won his lawsuit to taxpayer-funded gender-affirming care, but last I heard, as of September of last year, that doesn't include, removal of his genitalia. And so there's women who are often, victims of sexual violence housed with him in that female prison, and no one's advocating for them, Joseph. So, no one listens to their stories.
Sounds like a terrible threat to women, and FPA is proud to have prevented a policy like that in other states, specifically Maryland a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We were fairly instrumental in helping make sure that female prisoners are protected from having to share spaces like cells or changing areas with men, because the statistics show that's very dangerous for them. So that's a scary implication, as well as I'll just ask this quick follow-up. So I may live in Virginia, Becca, but I'm a lifelong hockey player, and Minnesota's the land of 1,000 lakes. You're a hockey state, USA.
That's correct.
If this passes, this would pave the way for boys to go play hockey with girls, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And we know from lots of research that Americans in general, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, are not in favor of allowing biological males to play with females. They take away opportunities, not just for one girl to play sports, but they take away potential scholarship opportunities for girls to go to university on scholarship and play their athletic, sports and grow in confidence. And so this has huge implications for culture and for women, honestly, self-selecting to opt out of these things because they know that they might be facing physical danger from sports or from, even using restroom facilities. I'm hearing reports, Joseph, of girls not using restroom facilities because they know that there are boys in there who will be given priority access by faculty.
Yeah, FPA has been privileged to engage in our Save Girls Sports campaign for the last several years now, and have seen almost half the states reserve girls' sports and girls' opportunities specifically for girls, which is magnificent progress, the continued progress of Title IX. And I encourage listeners to visit that part of our website to see why this is such a threat to women's physical safety and to their rights and opportunities. So I'm sorry that's a potential implication for this, Rebecca. I want to do two more quick follow-ups on the ERA for you. So first of all, you mentioned this would affect abortion in Minnesota. Explain to us how that would work.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, since the last session, Minnesota has legalized the right to abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy up to the moment of a child's birth. But that change was done through a statutory change. So just Minnesota law was changed, and that can be changed in the future, right? If a different majority comes into power and wants to make that a priority. What this would do is it would amend our state constitution to ensure that we have a constitutional right to abortion until the moment of a child's birth, taxpayer funded. And that's just different for the protections, right? And how it gets worked out, Joseph. Being able to change that could be, frankly, a generational thing, trying to undo the harms caused by this proposed amendment.
I see. Yeah, that's a little scary, but I think my last follow-up might offer our audience some hope, because you said this would impact parental rights too. However, I recently read about a settlement that I believe y'all at Minnesota Family Council and Institute helped facilitate between a group of religious families in one of the school districts. So maybe you could just inform our audience of this encouraging development in that litigation there.
Yes. Well, some wonderful news on that front. So like I said, this proposed ERA doesn't include any protections at this moment for religious freedom. However, Minnesota does have a statutory protection for families to opt out of any public schooling curriculum or content that they believe is not right for their child. And this has really come to the forefront within the past year. We have some families in St. Louis Park School District, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, whose children were exposed to LGBTQ content, and that was not in line with the family's religious beliefs. The families are Muslim Minnesotans, and they were concerned about their children being exposed to these topics. And so they opted out, which is fully within their rights as Minnesotans. And that opt-out was denied. And I don't want to say opt-out request because Minnesotans can opt out, Minnesota families can opt out for any reason. That opt-out request was denied. But those families were able to work with my colleague, Renee Carlson, who is our general counsel of True North Legal, which is the legal arm of Minnesota Family Council and Institute, who represented them together with a woman from First Liberty. And those rights right now are being respected and honored by the school district. The school district has stepped down and allowed them to use their rights as Minnesotans to opt out of that curriculum. But Renee's still monitoring it, but that was a big win and we're really proud of her.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Congratulations to her and to all of you for helping, partnering with those parents who want to exercise their rights and their religious liberty. It's great news. It's really encouraging. And it's a sign of some great lawyering. Renee's a great lawyer, so I'm really glad to hear about this. So that's encouraging. I want folks out there to know that parental rights do exist and do matter. And if you're a parent, you can exercise them when there's a conflict. So thank you for describing that to us. Rebecca, the Equal Rights Amendment is a big, heavy piece of legislation, and we've spent some significant time on it. There are two other pieces of legislation I want to ask you about. We can spend just a few minutes talking about each one before we wrap up, but I want our audience to be aware of them. So another piece of legislation, proposed legislation that is on the docket for you all in Minnesota this year is something called the Gender-Affirming Rights Act. That sounds a little bit Orwellian just on the face of it, but tell us just how Orwellian it is and what it means for your state potentially.
Absolutely. Well, this proposed policy is very, very broad, Joseph. It says every individual has the right to determine their own gender and related gender-affirming healthcare. Now, there's a lot to unpack, but in the interest of time, I want to say that word individual is not defined. So it includes males, females, children, having the right to identify in their own gender-related gender-affirming healthcare. Well, we know that means that children will be able to access this without any parental involvement. And this is not in children's best interests, right, Joseph? For the vast majority of children, the safest place for them to be is under the protection and decision-making of their parents. And when we say children have the right to determine their own gender-affirming healthcare, that means that the medical industrial complex has rights to contract with children, outside of the bounds sometimes of even the parents' knowledge. And that's, like you said, it's Orwellian and it is not in the child's best interest. Those doctors don't care about children the way the parents do. And so we're working to stop that and to bring knowledge of that policy to light.
We pray you're able to, because we at FPA believe, and you all I know believe this as well, that no child is born in the wrong body. And we also reaffirmed the historic constitutional standard, which is that parents have the right to direct the upbringing of their children, and that includes medical decisions, particularly ones that could cause irreversible harm And I invite the audience to look into the Help Not Harm campaign on FPA's website, which has been powerful in protecting kids from this kind of predatory medical practice. So we want to encourage you, Rebecca, and be praying for you guys to be able to stop that piece of legislation and help protect Minnesota kids who are vulnerable and struggling with who God made them. So thank you for telling us about that. One of FBA's other issues in Minnesota families as well is the issue of life and the pro-life movement. And there's a piece of legislation directly impacting that this year on physician-assisted suicide, which I know is a topic that's close to the hearts of our audience and all social conservatives and people of faith. Tell us what this piece of legislation would do in Minnesota if passed.
Absolutely. Well, it allows individuals who have received a 6-month life prognosis to get access to lethal drugs with the help of medical professionals. And Joseph, there's so much that could be said about this. And I know in the interest of time, I'll keep it brief, but it doesn't even require the individuals seeking the drugs to be Minnesotans. And it does require 2 medical professionals to sign off on this, but the one prescribing the lethal drugs doesn't need to be a licensed physician, according to the proposed policy. And the good news with this is that there is a broad coalition in opposition, and the word on the street is that there's a lot of people opposed. But the reason I wanted to bring it up, Joseph, is because it's an evergreen issue. It comes with a lot of money and lobbying efforts, right, in support of it. And so we expect to see this, unfortunately, year after year. And so no matter what happens with it this year, we'll be lobbying against it and lobbying for folks to receive adequate care. In Minnesota, we should be pioneering efforts to find ways to take care of people at the end of life. We have amazing healthcare here, but instead doing this. So.
You'll have fought this off before. You've stood firm against the culture of death, and we're grateful for that. The Minnesota Family Council and Institute is one of about 40 state family policy councils, as we at FPA call them, and we're so thankful to be able to host that network, facilitate collaboration between these groups, and support you all whenever we can and amplify your issues. And I get to work with groups like yours, Becca, and whenever I hear about policies like this that threaten all that God holds sacred in His people's rights, it makes me really, really thankful that groups like yours are there, standing in the gap, standing for the kingdom of God and for His beloved image bearers. So thank you for all that you do, and I want our audience to know how they can support you guys there, whether you're Minnesotans or not. Tell us what are you guys doing more specifically to stop these bills? Elaborate on that and how our audience can support you.
Absolutely. Well, in my role, I'm lobbying against them, right? And I'm trying to educate our constituents on what's happening. If people want to follow along, they can go to mfc.org. They can find resources there and sign up for our regular emails. You can also we have a podcast, a weekly podcast that comes out. You can find that on YouTube or Spotify. And you can follow us on social media too. But we're working to stop this and stop these policies and advance good policies, even in the environment that we're in. There's things that we can do. And we're just blessed to be able to have this role. And also, Joseph, we thank you so much for your support. Thank you for all of your work. You have a busy job with all of these organizations. So we wanted to thank you and thank you for having me on the podcast too.
I think I speak for everyone at FPA when we say it's an honor to be able to support state groups like yours. So audience, you've heard the call from Rebecca and the ways you can support her. I encourage you to do that. And also investigate at FPA's website. Go to familypolicyalliance.com. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a tab that says Allies. In that tab are listed all of the state family policy councils. I encourage you to connect with the ones in your state so that you can also help stand in the gap and for the kingdom of God against the imposition of the culture of death and our enemy. So thank you, Rebecca, for your time. Thank you to our audience for listening. We're so grateful to get to speak to you and to work on your behalf. We encourage you to continue to partner with us. This has been the SoCon Report podcast presented by Family Policy Alliance. We will see you again soon.